Lillian Hartley clutched her torn dress as she scrambled behind the small wooden church, her heart pounding like a frightened rabbit's as the sound of angry voices grew closer. The dust from her escape still clung to her trembling body, and tears streaked clean lines down her dirt-smudged face. Running away from her own wedding was not how she had imagined this day would unfold. But neither was being forced to marry a man 30 years her senior with a reputation that made even the most hardened outlaws shudder. Colorado Territory, 1872, was no place for a woman alone, but Lillian had decided that any fate was better than becoming Mrs. Albert Jenkins. Her father's gambling debts had sealed her future without her consent, and although she'd pleaded and begged, the decision had been final. The wedding had been arranged in haste, with barely enough time for her to process what was happening before she found herself standing at the altar in a borrowed dress, facing a man whose cold eyes had undressed her the moment she'd walked into the church. When the preacher had asked if anyone objected, Lillian had raised her own voice, shocking the small gathering. In the moment of stunned silence that followed, she'd hitched up her skirts and fled, running past the startled faces of the townsfolk who had gathered to witness the unholy union. Now, as she crouched behind the church, her breathing ragged and her limbs weak from exertion, she could hear Jenkins's angry commands to find her. The wedding guests had scattered across town, calling her name with varying degrees of sympathy or accusation. "Check behind the livery." Jenkins roared. "That ungrateful little harlot can't have gone far." Lillian pressed herself against the weathered boards of the church, praying that the deepening twilight would hide her from view. She hadn't planned beyond this moment, hadn't thought of where she might go or how she would survive. All she'd known was that she could not marry Albert Jenkins, a man known for having buried 2 wives already, both under questionable circumstances. The sound of approaching footsteps made her blood freeze. Someone was walking along the side of the church, their boots crunching softly in the dirt. Lillian held her breath, pressing herself harder against the rough wood, wishing she could disappear into it. The footsteps stopped. Lillian closed her eyes. "Miss," a voice whispered, so softly she almost didn't hear it. "Are you hiding back here?" It wasn't Jenkins's voice. This one was younger, softer around the edges, though still distinctly male. Lillian remained silent, unsure if this was a trap. "I know you're there," the voice continued. "I saw you run this way. I'm not with them. I want to help." Still, Lillian didn't respond. Trust wasn't something she could afford right now. A sigh. "Jenkins is offering $50 to whoever finds you. They're searching the whole town. It won't be long before someone checks back here properly." The stranger was right. Her hiding place was temporary at best. Even as the thought crossed her mind, she could hear more voices gathering at the front of the church, Jenkins barking orders to search the building itself. "Please," the voice said again. "I have a place you can hide, but we need to move now." Desperation finally won out over caution. "How do I know you won't just take me back to him?" Lillian whispered. "You don't," the man admitted. "But I reckon your chances are better with me than waiting here for Jenkins to find you." There was something in his voice, honesty perhaps, or a kindness that had been absent in everyone else she'd encountered since arriving in Silverton 3 weeks ago. Whatever it was, it made her decision for her. "All right," she whispered back. A hand appeared around the corner of the building, extended toward her. Lillian hesitated for only a second before taking it, allowing herself to be pulled to her feet. In the dim light, she could make out the silhouette of a tall man wearing a wide-brimmed hat, a cowboy from the looks of him. "I'm Yates," he said simply. "Yates Young, follow me and stay low." Keeping to the shadows, Yates led her away from the church, skirting the edge of town where the buildings thinned out and gave way to scrubland. They moved quickly but carefully, pausing whenever voices drifted too close. Lillian's wedding dress snagged on brambles and collected burrs, but she couldn't bring herself to care about the ruined fabric. After what felt like an eternity of silent, tense movement, they reached a small cabin set apart from the town, nestled against a rise in the land with a corral for horses off to one side. It looked humble but well-maintained. "It's not much," Yates said as he opened the door, "but Jenkins and his men won't think to look for you here." Lillian hesitated at the threshold. "Why are you helping me?" In the silver moonlight, she got her first clear look at her rescuer. Yates Young was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 25 or 26, with a face weathered by sun and wind but still handsome, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. "Because no woman should be forced to marry against her will," he said simply. "Especially not to a man like Jenkins." Inside the cabin was sparse but clean. A single room with a bed in one corner, a small table with 2 chairs, a stove, and a chest for storage. Yates quickly lit a lamp, casting the room in a warm glow. "You can stay here tonight," he said, moving to stoke the embers in the stove. "Tomorrow we can figure out what to do next." Lillian stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance and the impropriety of being alone with a strange man in his home. But the alternative was far worse. "Thank you," she said, her voice small. Yates nodded, keeping his eyes averted as if sensing her discomfort. "There's water in that bucket if you want to wash up. I'll make us something to eat." As Lillian cleaned her face and hands, the events of the day caught up with her. Her shoulders began to shake with silent sobs. She'd run away from her wedding, was hiding in a stranger's cabin, and had no idea what tomorrow might bring. Her father had gambled away their small ranch in Kansas after her mother died, dragging Lillian to Colorado territory in search of mining opportunities. When those failed to materialize, he'd racked up debts at Jenkins's saloon until the only thing of value he had left to wager was his daughter's hand in marriage. "Are you all right, Miss Hartley?" Yates asked, his voice gentle as he placed a plate of beans and cornbread on the table. Surprised, Lillian looked up. "You know my name. Everyone in town knows your name today," he said with a rueful smile. "It's not often a bride runs out of her own wedding." Despite everything, Lillian found herself returning his smile. "I suppose not." She moved to the table, accepting the simple meal gratefully. "May I ask how you knew I'd be behind the church?" Yates sat across from her, his own plate untouched. "I was at the wedding, at the back. I do odd jobs for Pastor Williams sometimes." He paused. "When you ran, I saw which way you went." Everyone else was too shocked to move right away. I slipped out while they were still standing there with their mouths open. Lillian remembered the blur of faces as she'd fled, but Yates's hadn't registered. "I didn't notice you." "Most people don't," he said without self-pity. "I keep to myself mostly." They ate in silence for a few minutes, the simple food tasting better than anything Lillian could remember. Perhaps it was just the relief of escape that seasoned it. "What will you do now?" Yates finally asked. Lillian set down her fork, the question highlighting her complete lack of options. "I don't know," she admitted. "I can't go back to my father and I have no money to leave town." "Jenkins won't give up easily," Yates warned. "He's not a man used to being denied what he wants." "I know," Lillian whispered, "but I couldn't marry him the way he looked at me." She shuddered. Yates nodded in understanding. "He's buried 2 wives already. Some say it was fever that took them, but others say it was his own hands," Lillian finished. It was the worst-kept secret in town, whispered about by the women who had tried to warn her when the engagement was announced. The night deepened around them as they discussed possibilities. Lillian could try to find work in another town, but without money for a stagecoach ticket or references for employment, her prospects were grim. The reality of her situation settled over her like a heavy blanket. "You should take the bed," Yates said when their meal was finished. "I'll sleep on the floor." Too exhausted to argue, Lillian agreed. The bed was narrow but clean, with a quilt that smelled of sunshine and pine. As she settled in, she watched Yates make a pallet for himself near the stove, keeping a respectful distance. "Why did you really help me, Mr. Young?" Lillian asked as he extinguished the lamp. "You're risking a lot." In the darkness, she couldn't see his face, only the silhouette of his shoulders as he arranged his bedding. "My sister," he said after a long moment. "She was forced to marry a man like Jenkins when she was your age." He beat her until she lost the baby she was carrying, and then he beat her some more. By the time I found her and brought her home, it was too late. She died 3 days later." The quiet pain in his voice made Lillian's heart ache. "I'm so sorry." "Get some rest, Miss Hartley," Yates said softly. "Tomorrow will come soon enough." Morning arrived with the sound of horses approaching. Yates was up instantly, moving to the window to peer cautiously outside. "It's a search party," he said grimly. 5 men, Jenkins leading them. Lillian scrambled from the bed, her heart pounding. "They'll search the cabin." Yates nodded, already moving to gather supplies. "There's a cellar door under that rug. It's small, but you should fit. I use it to store root vegetables in winter." Together they rolled back the worn rug, revealing a trapdoor. Yates lifted it, exposing a dark space below. "It's not deep, but it should hide you. I'll try to get rid of them quickly." Without hesitation, Lillian climbed down into the earthen cellar. It smelled of soil and old potatoes, but it was dry. Yates handed down a blanket. "Whatever you hear, don't make a sound," he instructed before closing the door and replacing the rug. Moments later, Lillian heard the cabin door open and multiple sets of boots enter. "Yates," Jenkins's voice boomed. "Been a while since you graced us with your presence in town." "Mr. Jenkins," Yates replied, his voice neutral. "What brings you and your men out this way?" "My bride went missing yesterday," Jenkins said, his words dripping with false concern. "Pretty little thing. Name's Lillian. We're checking all the outlying properties." "Sorry to hear that," Yates said. "Haven't seen anyone out this way. I've been breaking that new Mustang I bought from Carson." The sound of boots moving around the cabin made Lillian hold her breath. She could hear them opening cupboards, moving furniture. "Mind if we take a look around?" Jenkins asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Already doing it, aren't you?" Yates observed dryly. The footsteps moved across the floor above Lillian's head. She closed her eyes, praying they wouldn't notice the trapdoor beneath the rug. "What's your interest in the girl anyway, Jenkins?" Yates asked, clearly trying to distract them. "Plenty of women who'd be happy to marry a man of your standing." Jenkins laughed, a cold sound with no humor. "She's payment for a debt. Her father owes me $3,000. Besides, I like them young and spirited. The fight makes breaking them all the more satisfying." Lillian felt sick at his words, at how casually he spoke of her as if she were an animal to be tamed. "Nothing here, boss," one of the men reported. "You sure you haven't seen her, Young?" Jenkins pressed. $50 reward for information. Could buy a lot of supplies for this. Hovel. "I haven't seen her," Yates repeated firmly. There was a long, tense silence, and then Jenkins spoke again. "All right, boys, let's move on. Plenty more ground to cover." The boots moved toward the door, but Jenkins's voice came again. "You know, Yates, I remember your sister. Pretty thing. Shame what happened to her. Would be a shame if something similar happened to you." The threat hung in the air, followed by the sound of the door closing and horses moving away. Still, Lillian didn't move, afraid it might be a trick. Only when the trapdoor opened and Yates's concerned face appeared did she release the breath she'd been holding. "They're gone," he confirmed, reaching down to help her up. "But they'll be back. Jenkins doesn't give up that easily." Lillian climbed out, her limbs stiff from being cramped in the small space. "What are we going to do?" Yates ran a hand through his dark hair, his expression troubled. "You need to get out of Silverton, far away where Jenkins can't find you." "But how? I told you I have no money." "I have some saved," Yates said. "Enough for a stagecoach ticket to Denver, maybe. You could find work there, start over." Lillian stared at him, overwhelmed by the offer. "I couldn't take your savings." "What else are you going to do?" he challenged gently. "Stay here and eventually be caught by Jenkins. Or try to make it on foot through territory crawled with dangers a city girl like you isn't prepared for." He was right, of course. Her options were limited, and Denver represented her best chance at freedom. Still, the idea of taking this kind stranger's hard-earned money didn't sit right with her. "I'll pay you back," she promised. "Somehow I'll find a way." Yates smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "I believe you would, but let's worry about getting you safely away first." They spent the day preparing. Yates rode into a neighboring town to avoid suspicion, returning with supplies including a simple dress and coat for Lillian to replace her ruined wedding gown. He also brought news that the stagecoach would pass through that town the following morning, bound for Denver. "We'll leave before dawn," he explained as they ate a simple supper. "It's a 2-hour ride to Durango. The stage leaves at 8. Lillian nodded, trying to imagine what awaited her in Denver. She had some skills. She could read and write well, knew basic arithmetic, and was handy with a needle. Perhaps she could find work as a seamstress or shopgirl. "What will you do after I'm gone?" she asked Yates, realizing she'd grown accustomed to his quiet presence in just one day. He shrugged. "Same as always. Train horses, do odd jobs, keep to myself." "Sounds lonely," Lillian observed. "It's peaceful," he countered, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of that himself. They retired early, knowing morning would come quickly. This time, Lillian insisted Yates take the bed while she used the pallet by the stove, but he refused. "My mother raised me better than that," he said firmly. As she lay in bed, listening to Yates's steady breathing across the room, Lillian found herself wishing things could be different. In another life, perhaps she might have met this kind, honorable man under better circumstances. The thought of never seeing him again after tomorrow left an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. Dawn had barely begun to lighten the sky when Yates woke her. They moved quietly, gathering the few things she would take with her. Yates had packed food for the journey and counted out money for her ticket and enough to sustain her for a short while in Denver. "It's not much," he apologized, "but it should get you started." "It's more than I could have hoped for," Lillian said sincerely. They saddled 2 horses in the dim light, Yates's own sturdy gelding, and a gentle mare he sometimes used to carry supplies. Lillian's experience with riding was limited, but the mare seemed docile enough. They had just mounted when the sound of approaching riders reached them. "Jenkins," Yates said grimly, instantly recognizing the threat. "They must have been watching the cabin." "What do we do?" Lillian asked, panic rising in her throat. Yates made a quick decision. "Change of plans. We'll have to ride south instead. There's a trail through the mountains that Jenkins and his men won't know. It's rougher going, but it leads to a small settlement where we might find help." Without waiting for her response, Yates urged his horse forward, leading them away from the approaching riders and toward a line of trees that marked the beginning of steeper terrain. Lillian followed, clinging to her saddle as the mare navigated the increasingly rocky path. Behind them, shouts indicated that Jenkins and his men had discovered their escape. The sound of pursuit drove them deeper into the wilderness, following game trails and dry creek beds that Yates seemed to know by heart. "How do you know these trails?" Lillian called as they paused briefly to let the horses rest. "I used to hunt these mountains with my father," Yates explained. "Before he died in the silver mines, not many townfolk venture this far out." The pursuit continued throughout the day, with Jenkins and his men sometimes drawing alarmingly close before Yates would find another hidden path or shortcut to put distance between them again. By late afternoon, both riders and horses were exhausted, but they had to press on. "There's an old line shack about an hour ahead," Yates told her as the sun began its descent. "Trappers use it sometimes in winter. We can rest there for the night." The shack, when they finally reached it, was little more than 4 walls and a roof with a small fireplace and a single cot. But it offered shelter and a chance to rest, which was all they needed. Yates secured the horses in a small lean-to attached to the back of the shack while Lillian gathered wood for a fire. Inside, they worked in weary silence to create some comfort in the rustic shelter. Yates built a fire while Lillian arranged their meager provisions. "Do you think they're still following?" Lillian asked as they sat by the fire, sharing a meal of jerky and hard biscuits. "Probably," Yates admitted. "Jenkins is stubborn, but they'll have a hard time tracking us in the dark." "We should be safe until morning." Lillian nodded, too tired to feel the fear that had been her constant companion since fleeing the church. "Thank you," she said softly, "for risking everything to help me." Yates looked at her across the fire, his face softer in the golden light. "You remind me of her sometimes. My sister, she had the same courage." "I don't feel very courageous," Lillian confessed, "just scared and very lucky that you were there. Running away from that wedding was brave," Yates insisted. "Most women would have resigned themselves to their fate." They fell into comfortable conversation as the night deepened around them. Lillian shared stories of her childhood in Kansas, of her mother who had taught her to read and write, and her father who had been a different man before grief and gambling took hold of him. Yates spoke of his sister Emily, of breaking wild horses, and of his dreams to someday have a proper ranch of his own. "Why haven't you?" Lillian asked. "Started your ranch, I mean." Yates poked at the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. "Never seemed to be the right time. Or maybe I just never had a good enough reason to put down roots." The single cot presented a problem when it came time to sleep, but Yates solved it by insisting Lillian take it while he slept on the floor near the fire. Despite her protests, he was firm. "I've slept on harder ground than this," he assured her. Morning came with no sign of Jenkins and his men, but Yates remained cautious. They ate a quick breakfast and prepared to continue their journey south. "The settlement I mentioned is about a day's ride from here," Yates explained as they saddled the horses. "It's small, but there's a general store and sometimes a freight wagon that runs to larger towns. We might be able to find you passage on one of those." They rode steadily through the morning, the terrain growing more difficult as they climbed higher into the mountains. Lillian's inexperience with riding became more apparent as the trail narrowed, but she gritted her teeth and persisted, determined not to slow them down. It was nearing midday when disaster struck. A rattlesnake, disturbed by their passing, struck at Lillian's mare. The horse reared in panic, throwing Lillian to the ground before bolting back down the trail. Yates dismounted immediately, rushing to where Lillian lay stunned but thankfully not seriously injured. "Are you hurt?" he asked, helping her to sit up. "Just bruised, I think," she said, wincing as she tested her limbs. "But the horse, gone," Yates confirmed grimly. "And with it, half our supplies." The situation had suddenly become more dire. With only one horse between them, their progress would be much slower. Yates helped Lillian to her feet, supporting her as she found her balance. "Can you ride?" he asked. Lillian nodded, though every part of her ached from the fall. "I'll be fine." "We'll ride double," Yates decided. "It'll be harder on the horse, but we don't have much choice." He helped her onto his gelding before mounting behind her. The close proximity was improper by any standard, but survival had a way of pushing social conventions aside. Still, Lillian couldn't help but be aware of Yates's arms around her as he took the reins, of the solid warmth of him at her back. They made slower progress after that, having to stop frequently to rest the horse. The delay gave Jenkins and his men time to gain ground, and by late afternoon they could hear distant voices echoing through the canyons behind them. "They're getting closer," Lillian said fearfully. Yates nodded, his expression grim. "We need to find a place to hide until dark, then we can continue on foot if necessary." They left the main trail, picking their way carefully through dense underbrush until they found a small clearing sheltered by a rock overhang. It wasn't ideal, but it offered some protection and a place to rest. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in gold and crimson, Lillian and Yates huddled together for warmth. The temperature was dropping rapidly with nightfall, and neither had packed for an extended journey in the wilderness. "Why are you doing all this?" Lillian asked suddenly. "You could have sent me on my way after hiding me for one night. You didn't have to risk your life like this." In the fading light, Yates's expression was difficult to read. "I told you about my sister. This is more than that," Lillian interrupted gently. "You could have given me money for a ticket and directions to the stagecoach. Instead, you're here, hunted alongside me." Yates was silent for a long moment. "When I saw you run from that church," he finally said, "something inside me recognized something in you, a spirit that shouldn't be broken. And then when I learned who you were running from..." He shook his head. I couldn't let Jenkins get his hands on you. Not after what men like him did to Emily. There's more to it than that, Lillian persisted, sensing there was something he wasn't saying. Yates sighed, his breath visible in the cooling air. Maybe there is, he admitted. Maybe I've been alone too long. Maybe seeing someone with the courage to run from a life they didn't want made me think about my own choices. His honesty touched something in Lillian. In the short time she'd known him, Yates Young had shown more kindness and integrity than any man she'd ever met. And despite the danger, despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, she couldn't regret the path that had brought them together. I'm glad it was you who found me behind that church, she said softly. Yates's arm tightened around her shoulders. So am I. The moment was broken by the distant sound of voices. Jenkins and his men were still searching, and they were getting closer. We need to move, Yates whispered, rising to his feet and helping Lillian up. They gathered their remaining supplies and the horse, moving as quietly as possible through the darkening forest. The moon was just rising, casting enough light to make their way, but also making them more visible to pursuers. They had gone perhaps half a mile when the sound of a gunshot split the night, followed by a cry of pain from Yates. He stumbled, clutching his shoulder. "Yates!" Lillian gasped, catching him before he could fall. "I'm all right," he gritted out, though blood was already soaking through his shirt. "Keep moving." But it was too late. The sound of horses approaching fast told them Jenkins and his men had found them. Within moments, they were surrounded, Jenkins's triumphant face illuminated by the moonlight as he sat astride his horse, a smoking pistol in his hand. "Found you at last," he said, his voice cold with anger. "You've led us on quite a chase, my dear." Lillian stood her ground, placing herself between Jenkins and the injured Yates. "I'm not your dear, and I never will be. I would rather die here than become your wife." Jenkins laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally in the quiet forest. "That can be arranged, but first, let's deal with your gallant protector." He aimed his pistol at Yates again. "No," Lillian cried, spreading her arms as if she could shield him. "If you want me to go with you peacefully, you'll let him live." Jenkins considered this, his eyes calculating. "And if I refuse, you'll what? Run again?" "There's nowhere left to run, girl." "Then you'll have to drag me back," Lillian said defiantly, "every step of the way. And I promise you, I will make your life a living hell until the day one of us dies. Which, given your history with wives, might be sooner than you think." A murmur ran through Jenkins's men at her words. The rumors about his previous wives were well known but rarely spoken of so openly. Jenkins's face darkened with rage. She's right," one of his men interrupted unexpectedly. "This has gone too far, Jenkins. Chasing a girl through the wilderness because she doesn't want to marry you, this isn't right." "Shut your mouth, Carter," Jenkins snapped. "She's mine by right. Her father signed the contract." "A contract for a human being isn't worth the paper it's written on," Yates said, his voice strained but steady as he pushed himself to his feet. "And if you try to take her, you'll have to kill me first." Jenkins raised his pistol again, but another of his men moved his horse forward, blocking his aim. "No more, boss. I didn't sign on for murder." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Jenkins looked from face to face, seeing the resolve in Lillian's eyes, the determination in Yates's, and the growing unease among his own men. Finally, with a curse, he lowered his gun. "Fine. Keep the ungrateful wench. She's not worth the bullet it would take to end you, Young." He turned his horse sharply. "Let's go, boys. I've wasted enough time on this fool's errand." One by one, the men turned their horses and followed Jenkins back down the mountain, leaving Lillian and Yates alone in the moonlit forest. The moment they were gone, Lillian rushed to Yates, helping him sit down against a tree. "Let me see your shoulder." The wound was a clean through and through, missing any vital areas but still serious enough to need attention. Using strips torn from her petticoat, Lillian cleaned and bandaged it as best she could. "We need to get you to a doctor," she said worriedly. "The settlement isn't far," Yates said through clenched teeth. "We can make it by morning if we keep moving." They continued their journey through the night, Lillian now leading the horse with Yates mounted to spare him the exertion of walking. By dawn, they could see smoke rising from chimneys in the distance. The small settlement of Pine Creek welcomed them with cautious curiosity. The local doctor, an elderly man named Thompson, treated Yates's wound while Lillian explained their situation to the town's sheriff. "Jenkins has a reputation," the sheriff acknowledged. "You're not the first to run from him, miss, though you might be the first to succeed." With Jenkins no longer a threat, at least for the moment, Lillian and Yates were able to rest and recover in the town's small boarding house. Days stretched into a week as Yates's shoulder healed, and during that time, something shifted between them. What had begun as an act of kindness had grown into a deep bond forged by shared danger and mutual respect. Lillian found herself looking forward to their quiet conversations, to the way Yates's eyes crinkled when he smiled, to the gentle strength that seemed to radiate from him. "What will you do now?" Yates asked one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Still set on Denver, Lillian considered the question. The city still represented safety and opportunity, but the thought of leaving Yates behind left her feeling hollow. "I'm not sure anymore," she admitted. "What about you? Will you go back to your cabin?" Yates was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about that ranch I mentioned. There's good land south of here, not far from a growing town. With the money I've saved, I could make a start." "That sounds wonderful," Lillian said sincerely, though the idea of him settling somewhere she couldn't follow brought an unexpected ache to her heart. "It would be," Yates agreed. "But a ranch needs more than one person to run it properly." Lillian's breath caught as he turned to face her, taking her hands in his. "What are you saying, Yates?" "I'm saying that I never expected to find someone like you, Lillian Hartley. Someone brave enough to run from a life she didn't want, kind enough to care for a wounded stranger, and strong enough to stand up to a man like Jenkins." His eyes held hers, earnest and vulnerable. "I'm saying that I've fallen in love with you. And if you'd consider staying with me, building that ranch together, I would count myself the luckiest man alive." Tears filled Lillian's eyes as joy bloomed in her chest. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have since you opened that church door and led me to safety." Their wedding, 3 months later, could not have been more different from the one Lillian had fled. Held in the small church in Pine Creek, with wildflowers decorating every surface and sunlight streaming through the windows, it was a celebration of choice and love rather than obligation. As Lillian walked down the aisle toward Yates, whose face lit up at the sight of her, she thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From hiding behind a church in fear to walking into one with her heart full of hope, she had traveled farther than just the physical distance between Silverton and Pine Creek. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to this union, the silence that followed was the sweetest sound Lillian had ever heard. Years later, the young ranch would become known throughout the territory for its fine horses and warm hospitality. Travelers would tell of the handsome rancher and his beautiful wife, of their 3 children who grew up wild and free among the mountains, and of the obvious love that bound the family together. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, Yates and Lillian would sit on their porch and remember the desperate flight that had brought them together, marveling at how running from one life had led Lillian directly to the one she was meant to live all along. "I thank God every day that you hid behind that church," Yates would say, holding her close as the stars appeared above their home. And Lillian would smile, knowing that in running from a forced marriage, she had found not just freedom but a love that had been worth every moment of fear and uncertainty along the way.